Hi, Dorothy Littell Greco here. I live just outside of Boston with my husband Christopher and our fluffy, incredibly needy cockapoo Leo. And I spend my days making photos and writing. I'm the author of 2 books, Making Marriage Beautiful and Marriage in the Middle. My husband Christopher and I are passionate about helping folks to dig into their faith and figure out how that faith might influence everything from their marriage to their parenting to how they interact with their family members, to what it feels like to be in contemporary culture as a believer. And we will celebrate 30 years of marriage soon. We have 3 sons, all of whom are living outside our home now. So I wanted to talk about how disappointment can help us grow. Over the past 25 years that Christopher and I have been doing pastoral care, we've noticed that this topic is seldom talked about, but it really is a huge player for all of us in how we experience our faith, our families, our marriage, etc. And it's also been very personal because Christopher and I have dealt with a lot of disappointment in our marriage. We both tend to create and hold high expectations for ourselves and for others, and that, of course, has been conflictual. So I want to give you a little backstory. I grew up in the 1960s, and I watched every single Disney movie that was ever made. And normally, in these movies, there's a princess who's waiting to be rescued, waiting to be swept off her feet. And while the princesses are waiting, they tend to sing and clean, and neither of those activities are terribly enjoyable for me. Heroines are mostly passive in the Disney movies. And these movies also led me to believe that I should be set on a pedestal by my husband, at least sometimes. And I think that really what that is idolatry, but of course I didn't realize it at the time. So these movies did not offer a very healthy or robust narrative for what it looked like to be a woman in a relationship, never mind if you were an outlier. And I didn't have a very good example for what marriage or romance was supposed to look like from my family. My parents' relationship was rocky from early on. They ended up getting divorced when I was in my 20s. So Disney was kind of as good as it got. Additionally, I came into marriage with an affirmation deficit. I was very hungry to be affirmed. And Christopher, unfortunately, came from a family that did not dole out very much affirmation either. I'll just give you one little example that the 2 of us have talked about that I find rather humorous, but it's also kind of sad, that when his mom made a particularly delicious meal, the compliment that his father would give is, "It came good," not "Thanks for making it, really love this." It came good, as if the meal made itself. So he didn't really understand what affirmation looked like or meant. I had a desperate need for it. And as you can imagine, those 2 things clashed quite a bit. In Ecclesiastes 3, it talks about there being a season for everything. Year 10 in our marriage was a season of breaking. It was a time of tearing down and dismantling unrealistic expectations that we had for each other. It was a time for us to admit that we were actually both quite disappointed with some aspects of our marriage. And just to note, in this time frame, we were in the thick of parenting our 3 sons. We were homeschooling. I continued to work as a photographer, and we were both very active in the church that we had helped plant in Cambridge, and Christopher was on staff there. So that's a little of the backstory. So disappointment is an initial response to learning that our expectation will not be met. Disappointments can be hard to identify because they often hide behind other emotions that are maybe easier to name and easier to identify. So I'm just going to give you 5 seconds and answer this question. When I'm disappointed, the most common feeling I have is... Now, if we were in the room together, I would ask you to shout those out. And my guess is I would hear things along the line of angry, I feel ashamed, I withdraw, I feel guilty, I avoid the person who feels disappointed with me, I manipulate, I binge eat, I binge watch, I feel frustrated. So obviously there's a lot of different ways that disappointment manifests, and it's unique to each one of us. And disappointment also doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's almost always connected to our relationships and to the expectations that we have for those relationships. And I'll get to that in a minute. Disappointments we feel can be about a range of experiences. Some of them are very minor. You know, you do takeout and you get it home and it's cold and it's really not so good. You're disappointed. Your team lost the Super Bowl. Those kind of disappointments are minor, and we're generally resilient enough people that we can get over them and move past them. But there's other disappointments that are enormously consequential, and we can't just get over them. Maybe your spouse is not interested in coming to church or growing spiritually, and that's something that's really important to you. Maybe he checks out a little bit too much on the weekend. I realize that could be a gender stereotype, but run with me on this. Maybe you've had a miscarriage or you're struggling with infertility. These are not small deals, and they're not things that we can get over quickly. Personally, I don't like the feeling of disappointment, and more specifically, I really don't like to disappoint people, particularly people who are close to me, and I'm guessing that that's probably true for others of you. So to sum up this first beat, we all experience disappointment. Disappointment looks different on all of us, and some of the disappointments we experience are harder to get over than others. So let's talk a little bit about expectations, because the disappointments that we experience are almost always connected to the expectations that we carry. Most of our expectations come from one of three sources, and I'll speak briefly about each one of them. The first is our family of origin, and that includes our nuclear family as well as our extended family and our larger ethnic group. So when you were growing up, the ways that your parents and your family sort of moved through the world and engaged with each other all generally tend to lodge inside of us and then help us to create our own expectations. So as an example, when I was growing up in my family, we went on vacations every single year. We were blue collar. These were not extravagant vacations, often, a little concrete motel down by the Jersey Shore. Camping, we often drove. We very rarely flew any place, but we always went on vacation, and it was something that I really looked forward to. So when we got married, I obviously assumed that vacations were going to be part of our life. Christopher, on the other hand, only had one family vacation his entire childhood. And that's mostly because he grew up in an area where he had a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins. And so they would just get together and, have these parties and outside summertime things where they would all really enjoy each other. And that sort of took the place of vacation. If your family was conflict avoidant, you probably entered marriage with very specific expectations for how one should do conflict. If your father did all of the fixing and the repairs, the outside work, and your mother did all of the cooking and cleaning, chances are you carried those expectations into marriage with you. Our ethnicities or our cultures also have built-in expectations for what it looks like to be a man or a woman, what it looks like to parent, what it means to have company over for dinner. So Christopher's family, being a large, extended Italian-American family, whenever they had company, it was really important that they had at least twice as much food as they really needed. One, because they never knew who would just drop by opportunistically at mealtime. But two, to run out of food was actually a shameful thing. So it was super important for them to have an abundance of food. I grew up in a family that was not the case. And so early on, we had a fair amount of conflict when we would have company. Christopher would think, why are you not making more food? You're not making enough food. And I would feel like, there's plenty of food. What are you worried about? So family norms establish expectations in us, and that's how we learn to do things and relate to other people. If we didn't enjoy certain aspects of our childhood, we might consciously choose to create different patterns or different norms rather than following our parents' footsteps. So in addition to the family culture, there's the culture at large, and by that I mean where you grew up geographically and where you live now. So here in New England, I think that there's three main influencers of our expectations. One is education, two is sports, that you love them and you play them, and three is financial success. So it's not uncommon for me as someone who just has a bachelor's degree to feel woefully undereducated. I was in a meeting last year with a group of women writers, and within the first 5 minutes of meeting this one woman, she said, do you have a master's or a doctorate? And when I said no, I just had a bachelor's degree, she had this sort of dropped expression and then said, oh, well, yeah, we're not going to be able to have you on the podcast then. And I just remember thinking, don't you even want to get to know me before you decide that I'm not smart enough to be on your podcast? If you watch the commercials during the Super Bowl, I didn't watch the Super Bowl, but I did watch this one commercial, you get a clear sense of what American culture wants a man to be, right? You think about the Bruce Springsteen Jeep ad: rugged, macho, stoic, individualistic, jeans, cowboy hat, driving off into the sunset in your little Jeep or truck. And the third influencer of our expectations are our historic wounds, or the areas of pain that we bring into our marriage. And when I say historic wounds, I mean things that happened to you when you were growing up, when you were a child, in your early adolescence, or maybe even your early adulthood. And that could have been repetitive teasing or bullying when you were a child, your parents' divorce, a broken engagement, a failed marriage, any kind of trauma or severe loss, like having a sibling die or seeing a traumatic accident happen. Historic wounds lead us to create expectations that protect us from our pain. So we tend to have expectations that will not allow people to get close enough or to enter into that space. So one example in our marriage is that for a long time early on, when I would make a particular comment about some very small thing, for example, I would ask, Christopher not to leave his shoes right in front of the door because I found that irritating. What he would hear me say is, "You're an awful person, you're lazy, and you're a bad husband." I didn't say anything at all to that end. All I did was simply say, "Could you please not leave your shoes right in front of the door?" He had a negative expectation for what I was communicating because his mom often said one thing but meant something else. And so he didn't trust me to actually mean what I was saying or say what I would mean. So negative expectations can be a thing for us too. And his negative expectations for me caused him to distrust me and to be defensive. So that's a quick beat about how our expectations form. There's more on this in both of my books if you want to read more. And now I just wanted to talk a little bit about how expectations can be problematic. Expectations are problematic first and foremost when we moralize them, and meaning that we automatically assume that our perspective, our way of doing something is better and maybe even God ordained. And that might include anything from how we parent, to how you load the dishwasher, to how you engage with scripture or prayer. Moralizing energy is often toxic and leads our spouse many times to be defensive. So if you only remember one thing from this talk, remember this, that many of our expectations are not biblical, they're cultural. And we shouldn't treat our cultural preferences as if they're the gospel truth, because when we do, it leads to judging and criticizing. Number two, expectations are problematic when we're clueless that we even have expectations. So having some level of self-awareness about what your expectations are when you're disappointed is actually really important. And you can figure this out by paying attention to where you react, where you get defensive, or where your spouse reacts or gets defensive. Because sometimes we don't even know that we have expectations until we feel disappointed or angry. Which is why we have to learn how to recognize what disappointment looks like for us, and then we can back up and say, oh, I'm feeling disappointed right now. What was the expectation that just got dashed, right? So if you're not aware of your expectations, you can follow the disappointment back to the origin. 3, expectations are problematic when they're unrealistic. So we can sometimes identify unrealistic expectations by paying attention to where we routinely feel disappointed, like, the same thing again and again, or where we routinely have conflict with our spouse. So when our expectations for our spouse or our marriage or our children don't line up with who our spouse or our children really are, then most likely it's unrealistic. So if you know Christopher, you would agree with me that he's a highly extroverted person. He loves to talk, he loves to process things. And I like to talk too, but I'm an introvert. So I can easily get overwhelmed by the sheer volume of words that he sometimes brings to the table. This has led to him feeling disappointed in me, disappointed in that aspect of our marriage. So I've grown in my ability to stay in a conversation and to not just feel like, I can't listen to one more word. And he has grown in his ability to not expect me to be like him. So if you're married to somebody who's on the spectrum, they may not be able to emotionally connect the way you imagine that they would be able to connect. And I also just want to say that it took Christopher and me, I would say like 10 to 15 years to identify the expectations we had for each other and to recalibrate when they were unrealistic or ungodly. It's a long process and it can be really hard, but if we don't do this work, what happens is that we're likely to grow bitter and resentful, or even to just eject emotionally from the relationship. And when I say doing the work, what I mean is being aware of the expectations that we carry, owning them, talking about them with our spouse so we don't just expect them to read our minds, repenting and asking for forgiveness when we have been judging them or criticizing them for not being like us, and then creating realistic expectations for one another. I want to finish up by just talking about that. So in order to know what our disappointments are trying to teach us, we need to determine which expectations are good and godly versus which ones might be unhelpful or even ungodly and crushing. So many of the expectations that we bring into marriage that we learn probably from church and from our faith are not only good, they're essential if we want to have a good marriage and be good parents. So I think of monogamy, sobriety, honesty, forgiveness, taking care of ourselves, having self-control and modeling that to our kids. These are all expectations that are really important and we need to fight for. So if they're not there, I'm by no means suggesting that you would just say, oh, well, I guess that's unrealistic and I should let go of that. These are ones that we absolutely have to hold on to. But if I expect Christopher or my kids to be like me, to think like me, to act like me, to have the same temperament that I have, chances are I'm carrying unrealistic expectations for them. And again, we can discover which expectations are not helpful or are unrealistic based on where we get stuck relationally, where we overreact, where we feel hopelessness or despair, or where we or our spouse feels judged. And one, maybe easy way to think about this is, say you're going through the grocery store with your 18-month-old and your goal is to get in and out of the grocery store in 15 minutes, no stopping to talk with anybody, no sampling, no nothing, just in and out. And you have an 18-month-old with you. Well, guess what? Your expectation is unrealistic because your 18-month-old might need to go to the bathroom or have a diaper change. They might need a snack. They might have a tantrum. So if we have the expectation that they are going to submit to our plan, chances are it's not going to go as well as if we go in and say, I'm hoping I can get in and out of the store in a half an hour, but we'll see. We can have all kinds of expectations about any number of things, from how often we'll have sex to who cleans the bathroom to how many kids we have. But then we have to work those expectations out with our spouse, right? Through multiple conversations, through really being able to say, this is something that I can't let go of. This is really important to me. So we have to figure out how to make this work. There's a lot of compromising and there's a lot of negotiating that happens in this. So I want to be clear in saying that disappointment is not sinful. It's not abnormal. All of us feel disappointed. All of us feel disappointed at times in our marriage, if we're honest. We sometimes feel disappointed in our spouse, in our church, with ourselves. But we should never assume that our spouse intuitively knows what our expectations are, because more often than not, we need to communicate them. The problem with disappointment is if we get stuck in the disappointment, if we have endless conflicts about the disappointment, if we blame our spouse for the disappointment that we feel, or if we just give up and settle for a lesser marriage. So what Christopher and I have found is that disappointment can be God's way of saying, pay attention. I want to do something here. I want to bring you into a place of deeper wholeness and deeper healing, and I want your marriage to be more fulfilling than it is now. So disappointment can help us grow, but we have to recognize it, learn from it, and then do the hard work of sifting through the expectations that we carry and letting go of the ones that are hurtful or unrealistic, and pressing into God, because He never disappoints us. He's always going to be there and always going to be consistent. So if you want to connect with me, you can go to my website, which is DorothyGreco.com, Greco with one C. I'd encourage you to sign up for my newsletter. I do 2 a month, and that's where I tend to talk about faith, marriage, parenting, all that sort of stuff. And you can also find all my social handles there. And both of my books, Making Marriage Beautiful and Marriage in the Middle, can be found on Amazon. You can also find links through my website. And when I recorded this a couple days before you're watching it, Making Marriage Beautiful was actually only 99 cents, the Kindle version on Amazon. So grab it if you can. All right, well, thanks so much for listening. And I hope that this has been a helpful talk. I hope that it helps you to think about what disappointment can do for you if you pay attention to it. Thanks so much.